Can someone rise from extreme poverty to wealth just by changing their mindset? This is the story of someone who did it, without winning the lottery or inheriting a cent. He was born in a rural area without electricity or clean water. His family lived day by day and scarcity was the only thing in abundance. But something in him was different. Since childhood, he was curious about how the wealthy lived, not out of envy, but to discover if there was a formula behind financial success. At age 8, he made his first deal. He traded some corn seeds for an old notebook filled with business ideas written by someone else. He didn't understand much, but one sentence stayed in his mind. The rich buy assets, the poor buy liabilities thinking they're assets. By age 10, he was selling ice made with well water in plastic bags. He learned that effort isn't always rewarded equally, but consistency multiplies. At 12, while his friends played, he collected bottles to resell and save. It wasn't an obligation. He did it with a clear goal, to set himself free. His family told him he dreamed too much, but he clung to one idea. You don't need money to start, just a determined mind. He sold candy, recycled, helped in homes. Everything he earned, he split into 3: savings, investment, and education. He learned money isn't kept under the mattress. It must work, like any other employee. At 13, he convinced his cousin to open a lemonade stand. It lasted only 2 weeks, but they learned from their mistakes together. By 15, he had read over 30 personal finance books. No one in his village knew what financial freedom was. He already visualized it. He borrowed books, printed summaries from friends, even asked strangers to share how they succeeded. He started writing in his own notebook what worked and what didn't. He called it his manual for escaping poverty. At 16, he stopped spending to impress others. He preferred to invest in learning how to multiply what he had. While others asked for expensive phones, he asked for time with people who knew more than him. His life wasn't easy, but he felt in control. Every coin he earned was another stone in building his freedom. He once heard that money doesn't make you free, but knowing how to manage it does. That was a turning point. At 17, he launched his first business, fixing cell phones with used parts. Profits weren't huge, but he learned about margins and costs. He noted every income and expense. He said, "What gets measured improves." When he lost money, he didn't get frustrated. He asked, "What can I learn, and how can I avoid repeating this?" He understood that money punishes ignorance and rewards applied intelligence. At 18, he created his first full budget. For the first time, he knew exactly where every coin went. While others lived day to day, he planned months ahead and dreamed years ahead. At 19, he had already tripled his money through small ventures. The most valuable thing wasn't the money, but the confidence in his mind. He began giving small talks in schools about saving and thinking differently. Some laughed. Others listened carefully. Every day, he told himself, "My present doesn't define my future. What matters is the story I choose to write." His mindset changed before his bank account did. But once his thinking shifted, the money began to follow. He avoided complaints, victim thinking, and comparisons. Instead, he cultivated questions. What can I learn today? How can I improve? At 20, he knew he wanted to teach others to think differently. Because changing the mind changes destiny. At 21, he saved enough to move to the city. It wasn't luxury, but for the first time, he had his own bathroom and bed. He studied business administration at night and worked in a cafe in the mornings. His goal wasn't survival, it was learning the money game. He met people with high income but deep in debt, and others with little who lived with order. He learned it wasn't just about how much you earn. He focused on understanding money flow, not just income. He studied control, emotion, and the real value of time. At 23, he made his first investment in an index fund. It wasn't much, but that step changed his life more than any purchase. While others bought brand clothes, he bought books, courses, and tools. He knew every dollar invested in his mind multiplied returns. At 24, he launched an online store for recycled products. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The key was applying what he had learned, not just planning. In the first year, he sold little, but he analyzed mistakes, adjusted prices, and understood clients better. By the second year, sales doubled. With extra income, he started an emergency fund. His peace didn't come from having more, but from being ready for less. At 25, his business allowed him to live without working for others. He wasn't rich yet, but he had freedom, and that was his greatest win. People asked him what his secret was. He always said the same: I changed my mindset before I changed my reality. His surroundings didn't change first, his mind did, and that made everything else shift. He began studying financial psychology on his own. He wanted to understand how beliefs either sabotage or multiply our money. He learned about cognitive biases, irrational fears, and inherited patterns. Many people in poverty didn't know they thought like poor people. He taught that poverty isn't just economic, it's mental, and wealth starts in the mind before it reaches the pocket. He recorded his first lessons in his room with an old camera and a handmade whiteboard. Soon, his first 100 followers arrived. He started talking about how he used to think, I can't. That's not for me. I wasn't born for that. Words he no longer used. At 27, he was invited to his first financial education conference. He walked on stage with his original notebook in hand. He said to everyone, "This notebook changed my life. Not because of its content, but because it made me believe something greater was possible." His story went viral, not for being dramatic, but for being real. It proved anyone can rise, if they change how they think. He received thousands of messages from people who related to him. People who didn't know that thinking differently was the first step. He started teaching in vulnerable areas. His goal wasn't to give money, but ideas, because ideas create more money than coins ever could. He taught children to save with colorful envelopes, teens to spot liabilities disguised as assets, parents to talk about money without fear. He realized real wealth was sharing what he'd learned. Because teaching creates more impact than donations. Not everyone changed, but some did, and those few inspired others. It became an unstoppable domino effect. At 28, he wrote his first book. He titled it, Think Like You're Free, Not Like You're Poor. He gave it away in PDF to those who couldn't pay. He didn't seek fame. He wanted to be useful. He said his mission was to open windows in closed minds. Looking back, he remembered the waterless well, the zinc roof, the hunger at night. Not as trauma, but as the source of his power. He knew that if he could do it, others could too, because his greatest asset wasn't money. It was faith in who he could become. His story was just beginning, but he had already proven the most important truth. Money follows the mind, not the other way around. At 29, he opened a foundation to teach basic finance in rural areas. He called it Free Minds. He visited schools with a backpack full of toy bills, finance games, and stories about abundance and responsibility. He said if we change how kids view money, we change their future forever. He used simple examples. A mango sold for 5 is worth more than 3 eaten from anxiety. His foundation didn't seek charity. It sought mindset. Because only a strong mind can support a body without excuses. At 30, he was interviewed by national media. His story touched hearts because it had no filters, no exaggeration, just truth. He shared how he often ate plain rice while saving for a book that would change his thinking. He once said in an interview, "I wasn't born poor. I was born without knowledge. Now my eyes are open." His life became a kind of map for others, a real guide built step by step with no shortcuts. But he never stopped learning. He said, "The moment you think you know it all is when you become poor again." At 31, he started studying neuroeconomics. He wanted to understand what happens in the brain when someone spends without thinking. He became obsessed with emotions, guilt, euphoria, fear, impulse. Everything that makes money come and go without control. He discovered that many financial decisions are emotional responses, not logical calculations. He taught others to breathe before buying, to pause before spending, to feel before borrowing. At 32, he began creating digital content, courses, online workshops, free guides. His mission was that no one could say, "I didn't know how to start." He used real examples. If you earn 100 and spend 1 in 10, it's not the government's fault. It's your disorganized mind. His voice started reaching other countries. People from Colombia, Peru, Mexico, and Spain contacted him weekly. At 33, he reached his first financial goal, total independence. He no longer relied on active income. He lived off his assets and knowledge. But he kept working, not out of necessity, but purpose. Because once you find your mission, it's no longer just about money. In one of his most viewed videos, he said, "Being poor isn't your fault, but staying poor when you have access to information, that is." Some criticized him, saying he spoke from privilege. But he remembered the nights without food and the cracked walls of his childhood. He knew his truth wasn't for everyone, but he preferred to make people uncomfortable than to watch generations repeat poverty cycles. His family, who once doubted him, now supported him, not because of the money, but because of the transformation they saw. His most popular course was called How to Stop Thinking Like a Poor Person. Over 50,000 people took it in its first year. One young man wrote to him, "Your course made me cry. I realized I go into debt because I want approval, not because I need things." For him, that message was worth more than any income. It confirmed that wealth begins in the invisible. He said a poor mind seeks quick pleasure. A rich mind seeks long-term freedom. At 35, he began filming documentaries of real stories like his, people who changed their lives by changing their thinking. His channel surpassed 1 million subscribers, but he still recorded from the same desk where he wrote his first notebook. He never bought luxury cars or mansions. He lived comfortably, but with purpose. His luxury was peace, not appearance. He taught that every decision today builds your financial self for tomorrow. At 36, he traveled back to his hometown. He gave a talk at the same school where they once called him a useless dreamer. He cried seeing children taking notes, repeating his mantra, "I can, if I learn how." He hugged his former teacher, the only one who believed in him. He said, "You were my first emotional asset." His story became a movie, but he asked not to exaggerate anything. "Reality is powerful enough," he said. His life wasn't perfect or free of failure, but every mistake became an investment in learning. He taught that money can be lost and regained, but wasted time never returns. Today, he continues sharing his message. Poverty is fought with ideas, not just coins. Because a rich mind, even in poverty, is worth more than a full bank account with no purpose. At 37, he created a mentorship program for entrepreneurs in poor neighborhoods. He said talent wasn't missing. Mentors were. He visited local markets, talked to vendors, and gave advice for free. His reward was the smile of someone who learned something new. He taught them to sell from value, not from need. "The customer senses when you respect yourself," he said. At 38, he began writing a second notebook. This time, not for him, but for others. Freedom Mindset. He said it was the manual he wished he had when he was 12 and selling bottles. He gave away the first 1,000 copies. He said they weren't books, they were seeds, and each one could bear fruit if nurtured. At 39, he was named an advisor to a national youth development program. His message was clear: teach mental wealth before math. He repeated in every forum, "You don't need more stuff, you need more clarity." Poor people aren't always lazy or ignorant. Sometimes no one ever showed them another way. He chose to be that bridge. He never forgot who he was. And that's why he knew exactly who he didn't want to become again. His discipline was daily. Wake up early, read, think, write, serve. He knew the mind doesn't educate itself. He said that if every family talked about money without fear, the entire society would transform. At 40, he launched a global movement called Conscious Wealth. It was more than finance. It was a philosophy of life. Spend with intention, save with purpose, invest with wisdom. His greatest satisfaction wasn't his bank account, but the thousands of stories from people who turned their lives around because of his message. Children, single mothers, seniors, entrepreneurs, all with one thing in common. They changed their minds, and then their money. "I'm not special," he said. "I just chose to be responsible for my thoughts every day." He said freedom can't be bought. It must be built with solid mental habits and consistent action. He wasn't the hero of his story. His mind was, and that's why he protected it like his greatest investment. Because the mind is the only asset that, when used well, makes you free forever. At 41, he created a free virtual library with financial resources for all ages. His motto, "Knowledge is power. Sharing it is transformation." Every book, audio, and video had a mission: to break the invisible chains of financial illiteracy. He said where there is ignorance, there is control, but where there is education, there is personal revolution. In his community, no one called him the crazy dreamer anymore. Now they called him teacher, guide, example. But he never let ego take over. He said ego is the worst financial advisor. On his social media, he replied to messages personally. He knew every message hid a story waiting for direction. His day began with gratitude, not for what he had, but for all he overcame. People asked him what they needed to start. He replied, a notebook, a pencil, and the desire not to repeat your story. At 42, he was invited to an elite university to give a masterclass. He began by saying, I learned on the street, not in classrooms. He shared that his best lessons came from vendors, grandparents, and well-analyzed mistakes. He taught that failure is not the opposite of success. It's part of the path few want to accept. At 43, his online community surpassed 1 million students, each with a story, each with a new vision. Still, he visited neighborhoods, schools, public squares. He never traded his origin for a stage. He repeated that whoever forgets where they came from won't know where they're going. His wealth was internal. Money was just a tool, not a goal. He never taught magic formulas. He taught effort, mindset, consistency, vision, and focus. At 44, a young man asked what he would do if he lost everything. He replied, I'd write again, I'd serve again. That can't be lost. His identity wasn't tied to a bank balance. It was tied to a mission greater than himself. At 45, he wrote in his journal, my freedom began the day I stopped believing being poor was normal. He didn't speak from arrogance, but from the experience of having little and choosing not to stay there. When he turned 46, he opened a physical school. He taught everything from finance to emotional leadership. Students didn't just learn to add money. They learned to make conscious decisions. Every class started with this phrase, money follows you when you keep growing. To him, every person was a business, and their mind, the most powerful capital. He taught that the real inflation is mental, poor thoughts that raise the cost of your life. His message spread through books, schools, channels, companies, but his essence remained intact. He walked around with the same old backpack because it reminded him of his first step toward change. He never flaunted what he had. He preferred to share what he had learned. He taught that you don't need daily motivation if you have solid habits. At 47, he traveled to more than 15 countries to teach his method. But in every place he said, poverty is universal, and so is the chance to overcome it. In Africa, at a school made of dirt and wood, a child told him, I want to be rich to help others. And he cried, because he realized his story had planted seeds beyond what he imagined. At 48, he launched a network of mentors replicating his message in their own communities. He was no longer just a man with a story. He was a movement with thousands of voices. His vision was clear. If one rich mind changes, its entire environment changes too. He taught not to fear money, but to see it as a neutral tool, guided by your intention. He said the problem isn't money. It's what an unprepared mind does when it receives it. That's why he spoke of conscious wealth. Wealth that doesn't buy things, but buys freedom of choice. He never called success having more. He called it being more useful. At every conference, he closed with this phrase, I didn't come to impress you. I came to wake you up. At 49, his first students had become leaders, entrepreneurs, and mentors. His legacy was multiplying because it wasn't personal. It was shared. He taught that if you have knowledge and don't share it, your wealth is useless. He helped hundreds get out of debt. But more importantly, he helped them stop blaming themselves. Because guilt paralyzes, but responsibility sets you free. Every story he heard reinforced his mission. He wasn't just changing numbers, he was changing destinies. At 50, he published his autobiography. It was titled, Free on the Inside, Free on the Outside. It was translated into 12 languages and used in schools across several countries. But he kept saying the important thing wasn't the book, it was the internal shift it sparked. He didn't care about being remembered for numbers, but for igniting sparks in dormant minds. He repeated that the biggest mistake is thinking it's too late to change. He taught children as young as 6 and adults as old as 70, because transformation has no age. His life proved that one decision can redefine generations. He said if one poor child changes their mind, their whole family line changes with them. His dream was a world where talking about money isn't taboo, but basic education. He donated 70% of his income to educational projects, because he believed giving without teaching only comforts poverty. At 51, he said, I don't teach how to make money. I teach how not to depend on it. In his final online course, his first message was, don't seek results, seek financial identity. Because if you change who you are, everything else aligns. His method was no longer his, it belonged to the world. But his essence was still that of the boy who read that old notebook. At 52, he was nominated for an international award for his social impact. He declined, saying, "The real prize is watching someone thrive without fear." The media called him the invisible millionaire because his wealth was in what others couldn't see. He never wore expensive suits or drove luxury cars. He preferred walking with books in hand and a smile on his face. One day, someone asked if he was finally happy. He replied, "I was happy the day I realized I could choose my own mind." To him, freedom wasn't having a lot. It was not needing anything to be at peace. In his final years, he wrote letters to his youngest students. He told them, "Don't let fear become your teacher." He taught that fear only dominates those who are uneducated. At 53, he founded a digital community with thousands of volunteers teaching financial education in forgotten schools. His last project was to create a free app with mental exercises to reprogram limiting beliefs. He knew the real problem wasn't lack of money, it was mental programming in those handling it. In his final interview, he said, "I didn't defeat poverty. I defeated the thought that told me I had to accept it as my fate." He died at 54, but his message lives on in every mind that chose to think differently. His tombstone has no numbers, no titles. It only reads, "He changed his mind and changed the world." Today, millions repeat his story, not as myth, but as a real possibility. Because everything changed the day a child in extreme poverty asked, "What if I'm thinking like a poor person?" That question didn't just change his life, it changed thousands. Because thought is a seed and every action is water. What you water in your mind blooms in your wallet. This story is real, and you can be the next one. But only if you choose to change your mind first. Because the mind is the beginning of all wealth. It doesn't matter where you come from. It matters where you're choosing to think. He didn't wait for someone to give him opportunities. He created them, one idea at a time. Every poor thought he challenged became another brick toward his freedom. And you can do the same, with every habit, every decision, every thought. You don't need luck. You just need a deep shift in your way of thinking. Start today, with what you have, from where you are. Poverty can be inherited, but it can also be stopped. This story isn't about money, it's about identity. Subscribe to learn how to change your mind and your money to create wealth.